Out of the North, Part 1. Long before they carved out a kingdom on Italian soil, long before their name became attached to one of the wealthiest regions of modern Europe, the Lombards were, by their own telling, a small and unremarkable people, scattered somewhere in the cold landscapes of the north. Their story does not begin with armies or kings or conquered cities. It begins, as so many early medieval origin stories do, with a legend, a tale told and retold around fires long before anyone thought to write it down, a tale meant not to record history with precision but to explain who a people were and why they deserved to exist at all. The most complete version of this legend comes to us centuries later, from the pen of a Lombard monk named Paul the Deacon, writing his History of the Lombards in the closing years of the 8th century, after the kingdom he was writing about had already fallen. Paul drew on an earlier text known as the Origo Gentis Langobardorum, the origin of the Lombard people, itself a compilation of oral traditions stretching back generations before it was ever committed to parchment. According to this tradition, the Lombards began not as Lombards at all, but as a people called the Winili, living in a distant northern homeland the sources call Scanza, a name scholars generally associate with the Scandinavian Peninsula, though the precise geography remains, as with so much of this story, more legend than certainty. The origin tale tells of the Winili setting out from their overcrowded homeland in search of new territory, migrating southward under the leadership of two figures, a mother and her sons, whose story is wrapped in the kind of supernatural embellishment typical of foundation myths. The most famous episode describes a confrontation with a rival people, the Vandals, who demanded tribute or battle. Facing a smaller force, the Winili are said to have resorted to a trick of appearance rather than arms. Their women, the story goes, tied their long hair forward across their faces to resemble beards, creating the illusion of a much larger army of bearded warriors. The god Odin himself, looking down upon this scene from his window in the heavens, is said to have asked who these Longbeards were, and in naming them, unwittingly granted them both a new identity and his favor in the coming battle. From this moment forward, so the legend claims, the Winili became the Langobardi, the Lombards, the Longbeards, a people now marked by a name that would follow them for the rest of their history. It is important, in examining this story, to be clear about what kind of evidence we are actually working with. This is not history in the sense of a verified sequence of events. It is myth, shaped by generations of oral retelling, written down long after the fact by an author with his own reasons for wanting his people's origins to sound suitably heroic and divinely favored. Scholars today treat the Scanza migration narrative with considerable caution, recognizing it as a foundation legend rather than a reliable geographic or historical record. And yet these origin stories are rarely without value. Even when they cannot be trusted as literal fact, they tell us something real about how a people understood themselves, how they wished to be remembered, and what kind of identity they were actively constructing in an age when a group's survival often depended on the strength of the story it could tell about its own worthiness and favor. Where legend fades and firmer historical ground begins to emerge, we find the Lombards not in Scandinavia at all, but considerably further south, along the Elbe River in what is now northern Germany, appearing in the writings of Roman authors as early as the 1st century of our era. Tacitus, writing his account of the Germanic peoples, describes the Lombards as a small tribe notable chiefly for their fierceness relative to their size, surviving among more numerous and powerful neighbors precisely because of their reputation for warlike resolve. For several centuries afterward, the Lombards remain a relatively minor presence in the historical record, one Germanic group among many along the frontiers of a Roman world that was itself slowly transforming. The trajectory that would eventually carry the Lombards into Italy began to take clearer shape as they moved southeastward, away from the Elbe and into the region of Pannonia, a territory corresponding roughly to parts of modern Hungary and Austria, positioned along the Middle Danube. This was a landscape shaped by the churn of late antique migration, a crossroads where numerous peoples, pressured by shifting alliances, by the movements of other groups, and by the slow contraction of direct Roman authority in the region, jostled for territory and dominance. Here the Lombards came into sustained contact, and frequently conflict, with several of their neighbors, most notably the Heruli, whom they eventually defeated and largely absorbed, and later the Gepids, a rival Germanic kingdom whose long rivalry with the Lombards would culminate in a decisive war in the mid-6th century, a war the Lombards won with crucial assistance from an unexpected ally, the nomadic Avars, newly arrived from the steppes and eager for their own foothold in the region. This alliance with the Avars would prove to be one of the more consequential decisions in Lombard history, though not entirely in the way the Lombards might have hoped. Having helped destroy the Gepid kingdom, the Lombards found themselves now sharing the Danubian frontier with a powerful and unpredictable steppe confederation, one whose ambitions in the region showed no sign of stopping merely because a rival kingdom had been eliminated. It was this shifting and increasingly uncertain landscape along the Danube, more than any single dramatic event, that appears to have convinced the Lombards it was time to look elsewhere for a permanent home, and their gaze increasingly turned toward the rich and fertile lands of Italy, lying just across the mountains to the southwest. It is worth pausing, at this point in the story, to consider the broader world the Lombards were about to enter, because Italy in the mid-6th century was not simply an open and undefended prize waiting to be claimed. It was a land that had, only recently, been the site of one of the most exhausting and destructive conflicts of the entire late antique period. The Byzantine Empire, under its ambitious emperor Justinian, had spent nearly 2 decades attempting to reclaim Italy from the Ostrogothic kingdom that had ruled it since the collapse of Roman authority in the West, a series of campaigns known collectively as the Gothic Wars. These wars, though ultimately successful in restoring nominal imperial control over the peninsula, left Italy devastated in ways from which it would struggle to recover. Cities that had survived centuries of earlier upheaval were besieged, starved, and in some cases destroyed outright. Rome itself changed hands multiple times amid the fighting, its population and infrastructure battered by siege after siege. Agricultural production collapsed across much of the countryside. The elaborate administrative and economic structures that had once made Italy the beating heart of the Roman world lay in ruins, and the Byzantine forces who now nominally held the peninsula were stretched thin, exhausted by decades of continuous warfare and increasingly unable to project effective authority across the entirety of the territory they claimed to control. This, then, was the Italy that awaited the Lombards, not a stable and thriving Byzantine province, but a fractured, exhausted and thinly defended landscape, its old urban centers weakened, its Gothic rulers gone, its Byzantine garrison forces spread precariously across a territory far larger than they could realistically hold. It was a vacuum in nearly every sense of the word, political, military, and administrative. A space where a determined and mobile people, hardened by generations of migration and frontier warfare along the Danube, might reasonably calculate that conquest, or at least settlement, lay well within their grasp. The Lombards, who began gathering along Italy's northeastern approaches in the years leading up to 568, were, by this point, a people transformed almost beyond recognition from the small tribe Tacitus had once described along the Elbe. They were seasoned by centuries of movement, tempered by war against the Heruli and the Gepids, entangled in complicated relationships with both the Byzantine Empire and the Avar Confederation, and led now by a king, Alboin, whose military reputation and political ambition would soon carry his people across a threshold from which there would be no returning to the world they had known. Behind them lay the fading legend of a northern homeland and a name granted by a watching god. Ahead of them lay a battered peninsula, a fractured empire's overextended frontier, and the opportunity to become something entirely new. Not wanderers any longer, but rulers of a kingdom that would bear their name for centuries to come. Part 2. In the spring of 568, King Alboin led his people across the eastern approaches of the Alps and down into the plains of northern Italy, and with that crossing, an entire chapter of Mediterranean history quietly turned. This was not, by the standards of earlier barbarian invasions of the Roman world, a single dramatic battle that decided the fate of a peninsula in an afternoon. It was instead the beginning of a long and uneven process of conquest and settlement, one that would unfold over years and decades, reshaping Italy's political landscape into a form it had never held before and would not hold again for well over 1,000 years. The Lombards who crossed into Italy were not traveling alone. Alboin's force, as later sources make clear, was a genuinely mixed coalition, drawing in warriors and families from a range of peoples the Lombards had encountered and absorbed during their long migration through Central Europe, including remnants of the Gepids they had defeated, Saxons, and other groups drawn along in the wake of Lombard military success. This detail matters because it reminds us that the Lombard kingdom, which would soon take shape in Italy, was, from its very first days, never a purely homogeneous ethnic project. It was a coalition on the move, bound together as much by shared military fortune and leadership as by any single unified ancestry, a pattern common to nearly every so-called barbarian kingdom that took root on former Roman soil during this turbulent age. The conquest itself proceeded with striking speed across the northern plains. Byzantine resistance in the region, still recovering from the exhausting Gothic wars of the preceding decades, proved far too thin and fragmented to mount an effective defense. City after city in the north fell to Lombard control or negotiated terms of surrender, and within a remarkably short span of time, Alboin had established his capital at Pavia, a city strategically positioned along the Ticino River that would go on to serve as the political heart of the Lombard kingdom for the better part of 2 centuries. From this new center of power, the region that had once been simply northern Italy would, in time, come to bear a new name drawn directly from its conquerors, a name that persists on modern maps to this day: Lombardy. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine that the Lombard conquest of 568 and the years immediately following resulted in anything resembling total control over the Italian Peninsula. What emerged instead was a far messier and more fragmented political map, one that would come to define Italy's character for centuries to come. While the Lombards secured dominance across much of the north and pushed their control into scattered pockets further south, the Byzantine Empire retained a persistent, if reduced and increasingly disconnected presence across significant portions of the peninsula. Ravenna, seat of the Byzantine Exarchate, remained in imperial hands, along with Rome itself, still nominally under Byzantine authority, even as the Pope who resided there increasingly acted with a degree of independent political initiative that would only grow over time. Coastal territories in the south, along with Sicily, likewise remained outside direct Lombard control. The result was not a single unified kingdom stretching across a conquered Italy, but rather an Italy split into a patchwork of Lombard, Byzantine, and semi-autonomous territories, a fractured landscape whose political seams would remain visible for centuries. This fragmentation was not confined merely to the boundary between Lombard and Byzantine territory. It existed within the Lombard kingdom itself, in a tension that would shape its entire history. Beyond the royal territory administered directly from Pavia in the north, 2 great duchies emerged further south, at Spoleto and at Benevento, each ruled by a Lombard duke who exercised a degree of independent authority that often rivaled, and at times openly defied, the power of the king himself. These southern duchies, separated from the northern kingdom by a corridor of Byzantine-controlled territory running roughly through central Italy, developed political trajectories substantially their own, entering into their own diplomatic relationships, pursuing their own military campaigns, and only loosely and inconsistently submitting to royal authority from Pavia. This structural tension, a kingship in the north straining against powerful and often semi-independent dukes in the south, would remain a defining and recurring feature of Lombard political life for as long as the kingdom endured, a persistent reminder that Lombard Italy was never quite as unified as its name on a map might suggest. It is within this fractured but resilient kingdom that we begin to see the Lombards undertake one of their most significant and lasting achievements, a transformation from a warband of conquerors into the architects of a functioning and codified legal order. In the year 643, King Rothari issued what has come to be known as the Edictum Rothari, the Edict of Rothari, a comprehensive written compilation of Lombard law, the first of its kind for this people. This was no small undertaking. Committing the customary law of a Germanic people to a formal written text, in Latin, following conventions clearly influenced by the surviving legal traditions of the Roman world the Lombards now ruled over, represented a genuine act of state-building, a signal that the Lombard kingdom intended to govern not merely through the raw exercise of military force, but through a stable and consistent legal framework that could regulate everything from property disputes and inheritance to compensation for injury and the punishment of crime. The Edict of Rothari, and the further legal additions made by later Lombard kings in the decades that followed, reveal a kingdom in the process of genuine synthesis, blending Germanic legal custom, with its distinctive emphasis on compensation payments known as Wehrgeld to settle disputes and prevent escalating blood feuds, together with administrative and procedural conventions clearly drawn from the Roman legal tradition, still deeply embedded in Italian society. This was not a conquering people simply imposing an alien legal system upon a subjugated population. Nor was it a case of the Lombards being fully absorbed and erased into pre-existing Roman structures. It was something more genuinely hybrid, a legal culture forged from both traditions, adapted to the specific and complicated realities of ruling a diverse Italian population that included both the Lombards themselves and the far more numerous Roman Italian inhabitants who had lived on this land for generations before their arrival. This process of synthesis extended well beyond the courtroom and into the realm of religious identity, an area where the Lombards' evolution proved just as consequential for the shape of the kingdom they were building. The Lombards arrived in Italy adhering, at least in significant part, to Arian Christianity, a theological tradition regarding the nature of Christ that had been declared heretical by the mainstream Nicene Christianity practiced by the Roman Italian population and endorsed by the papacy in Rome. This religious divide added yet another layer of separation between conquerors and conquered in the kingdom's early decades, reinforcing a sense of the Lombards as outsiders even as they settled permanently onto Italian soil. Over the course of the 7th century, however, this religious boundary gradually dissolved. Successive Lombard rulers and their court increasingly moved toward Nicene Catholicism, the same faith practiced by the broader Italian population, a shift that both reflected and accelerated the deeper cultural blending taking place across the kingdom as a whole. This gradual religious convergence mirrored a broader pattern of integration unfolding across Lombard Italy throughout the 7th century. Intermarriage between Lombard settlers and the Roman Italian population increased. Lombard aristocrats began adopting elements of Roman administrative practice, Roman naming conventions, and Roman cultural habits, while elements of Lombard custom, law, and even vocabulary worked their way into the fabric of Italian society more broadly, leaving traces that would persist long after the kingdom itself had ceased to exist. What had begun in 568 as a conquest carried out by an outside military coalition had, within a matter of generations, evolved into something considerably more complex. A genuinely mixed society, Lombard in name and in ruling dynasty, but increasingly Italian in its everyday texture, its language, its faith, and its slowly converging sense of shared identity. By the closing decades of the 7th century and into the 8th, the Lombard kingdom stood as one of the more sophisticated and durable political structures to have emerged from the wreckage of the Western Roman world, a kingdom governed by written law, organized around a functioning if perpetually contested balance between royal and ducal authority, and increasingly at ease within the religious and cultural currents of the Italian Peninsula it now called home. It had weathered internal power struggles, absorbed and been absorbed by the populations it ruled, and constructed through the Edict of Rothari and the reigns of the kings who followed, a genuine legal and administrative legacy. Yet for all this accumulated stability, the kingdom's position within the broader political landscape of early medieval Europe remained precarious, hemmed in by the persistent Byzantine presence at Ravenna and Rome, and increasingly entangled in a deepening rivalry with an institution whose political ambitions in central Italy were only just beginning to fully emerge: the papacy. It was this rivalry, quietly building across these same decades, that would ultimately draw a new and far more formidable power down from beyond the Alps, setting in motion the final chapter of the Lombard kingdom's long and eventful history. Part 3. By the middle years of the 8th century, the Lombard kingdom had existed on Italian soil for close to 200 years, long enough for the descendants of Alboin's conquering warband to have become, in nearly every meaningful sense, Italians themselves, sharing the language, the faith, and increasingly the political concerns of the peninsula their ancestors had once invaded. And yet it was precisely in these mature and confident decades of Lombard rule that the pressures began building which would, within a single generation, bring the entire kingdom to its final and permanent end. At the center of this gathering crisis stood an institution whose political weight in Italy had been quietly expanding for decades: the papacy. From its position in Rome, nominally still under Byzantine authority, but functioning with ever greater practical independence as imperial power in the region continued its slow erosion, the papacy had grown into something considerably more than a purely spiritual office. Popes administered substantial landholdings across central Italy, organized the defense and provisioning of Rome in the face of external threats, and increasingly conducted the kind of independent diplomacy one would expect from a genuine territorial ruler rather than a bishop operating under distant imperial oversight. This growing papal territory, which would eventually come to be known as the Papal States, sat uncomfortably close to Lombard ambitions, wedged between the kingdom's northern heartland around Pavia and the semi-independent southern duchies of Spoleto and Benevento. Successive Lombard kings, eager to finally unify the fragmented Italian peninsula more fully under their own authority, cast an increasingly acquisitive eye toward these central Italian territories, including Rome itself. King Liutprand, ruling through much of the early 8th century, pursued ambitious campaigns aimed at extending Lombard control southward and consolidating royal authority over the previously semi-autonomous duchies, achieving real, if incomplete, success. His successors continued to press this expansion, and by the reign of King Aistulf in the 750s, Lombard forces had captured Ravenna itself, effectively extinguishing what remained of direct Byzantine administrative authority in northern Italy, and turning Lombard ambitions unmistakably toward Rome. This was, from the perspective of the papacy, an existential threat, rather than a mere territorial dispute. A Lombard kingdom finally succeeding in unifying the Italian peninsula under a single crown would leave the Pope as a subordinate figure within someone else's kingdom, stripped of the independent political standing that decades of Byzantine imperial weakness had allowed the papacy to accumulate. Facing this danger and unable to rely on meaningful military support from a distant and increasingly preoccupied Byzantine Empire, the papacy turned instead to a rising power beyond the Alps, a decision that would prove fateful not only for the Lombards, but for the future political shape of Europe as a whole: the Franks. The Frankish kingdom, under the vigorous and expanding Carolingian dynasty, had already developed a close and mutually beneficial relationship with the papacy in the years leading up to this crisis. Pope Stephen II, facing the immediate threat of Lombard expansion under Aistulf, made the extraordinary journey across the Alps in person to appeal directly to the Frankish king Pepin the Short, seeking military intervention against the Lombards in exchange for papal support that would help legitimize Pepin's own recent and somewhat irregular seizure of the Frankish throne. Pepin responded to this appeal with 2 separate military campaigns into Italy during the 750s. Successfully compelling the Lombards to relinquish their recent conquests, including Ravenna, and to hand over these territories not to the Byzantine Empire from which they had been taken, but to the papacy itself, an act that laid the essential territorial foundation for the Papal States that would persist as a political entity for over 1,000 years afterward. This Frankish intervention under Pepin bought the Lombard kingdom a further period of uneasy survival, but it did not resolve the underlying rivalry between Lombard ambition and papal independence, a rivalry that flared once more, and this time fatally, under Pepin's son and successor, Charlemagne. King Desiderius, who had ascended the Lombard throne in the aftermath of these earlier conflicts, continued to press Lombard interests against papal territory in central Italy, and attempted to secure his kingdom's position through a complex web of dynastic marriage alliances, including, for a time, a marriage connection with Charlemagne himself. This alliance, however, proved short-lived and ultimately counterproductive, and as tensions between Desiderius and the papacy escalated once again in the early 770s, Pope Hadrian I issued an urgent appeal to Charlemagne for direct military intervention. Charlemagne's response, launched in 773, would prove decisive in a way that Pepin's earlier campaigns had not. Leading Frankish forces across the Alps, Charlemagne laid siege to Desiderius at the Lombard capital of Pavia, a siege that, after months of resistance, finally succeeded in the summer of 774. With the fall of Pavia, Desiderius was captured, and the independent Lombard kingdom, after more than 2 centuries of rule across northern and central Italy, effectively ceased to exist as a sovereign political entity. Charlemagne did not simply defeat the Lombards and withdraw, as Pepin had done a generation earlier. He absorbed the kingdom directly into his own expanding Frankish realm, taking for himself the ancient title King of the Lombards alongside his existing Frankish kingship, and in a deliberate act of political symbolism, having himself crowned with the Iron Crown, the traditional coronation crown of the Lombard kings, a relic still preserved and displayed in Italy today. Northern Italy, the very heartland the Lombards had conquered and governed since 568, now became simply another province within the vast and growing Carolingian Empire. Yet even this decisive conquest did not entirely erase Lombard political existence from the map of Italy. In the far south, the Duchy of Benevento, geographically remote from the Frankish campaigns that had toppled Pavia and long accustomed to functioning with a substantial degree of independence from the northern Lombard crown, even in the kingdom's strongest years, remained outside Charlemagne's direct control. Under its own dukes and later princes, Benevento continued to exist as an independent Lombard political entity for centuries after the fall of the Northern Kingdom, its rulers navigating a complicated and shifting landscape of relations with the Byzantine Empire, the papacy, and various other powers contesting influence in southern Italy, before finally succumbing to conquest by Norman adventurers in the 11th century. In this sense, the true and final end of independent Lombard rule in Italy came not in 774 at Pavia, but centuries later, far to the south, in a duchy that had always stood somewhat apart from the story of the Northern Kingdom. What then did this vanished kingdom actually leave behind once its final independent political structures had, one by one, been absorbed into the successor states that followed? The most immediately visible legacy is also the simplest: the name itself. The region of northern Italy that the Lombards conquered in 568 and ruled from Pavia for 2 centuries still carries their name today: Lombardy, a modern Italian region encompassing Milan and much of the economically vital heart of the country, a lasting geographic inheritance from a people who arrived as outsiders from beyond the Alps, and in the process of conquering and governing, became permanently woven into the identity of the land itself. Beyond this most visible marker, the Lombard legal tradition established through the Edict of Rothari and its subsequent additions continued to exert influence on Italian legal development long after the kingdom's political demise, its distinctive blend of Germanic customary practice and Roman procedural influence feeding into the broader evolution of medieval Italian law across the centuries that followed Frankish conquest. Traces of Lombard language and personal naming conventions likewise persisted within Italian culture, absorbed and gradually transformed within the broader Italian linguistic tradition, much as the Lombard people themselves had been absorbed into, even as they helped reshape the Italian population among whom they settled. Perhaps the most valuable legacy of the Lombards, however, is neither linguistic nor legal, but interpretive. A lesson in how we ought to understand peoples who are too easily flattened into simple categories by the historical labels attached to them. For centuries, the very word Lombard, alongside so many other names attached to the peoples who established kingdoms across the ruins of the Western Roman Empire, carried with it the weight of the term barbarian, implying destruction, disruption, and the crude displacement of a superior Roman civilization by rougher outside forces. The actual history of the Lombards in Italy tells a considerably more complicated and more interesting story. They arrived as conquerors, certainly, and their invasion brought genuine disruption and violence to a peninsula already exhausted by decades of prior warfare. But what followed was not simple destruction. It was 2 centuries of genuine state-building, of written law, of religious transformation, of gradual and substantial cultural fusion between conquerors and conquered, producing a kingdom that, whatever its internal tensions and eventual conquest, stands as one of the more sophisticated and enduring political achievements to emerge from the fractured landscape of the post-Roman West. A people who began in their own half-remembered legend as wanderers fleeing an overcrowded northern homeland, disguising their women as bearded warriors to survive a single desperate battle, ended their political history as the namesake of one of Europe's most prosperous and historically significant regions, their law woven into the fabric of Italian legal tradition, their capital's ancient crown still displayed today as a symbol of Italian kingship itself. It is a trajectory that captures, perhaps better than almost any other single story from this turbulent age, just how thoroughly the old boundary between barbarian invader and civilized inheritor could dissolve, over the span of a few centuries, into something far more genuinely and permanently intertwined.